Commander Velith Kyranos stood on the observation deck of the Coalition warship, endless vigil, and watched the toxic clouds of Surthax 7 swirl beneath him like a slow and angry ocean. He had served in the Galactic Coalition fleet for 20 cycles, and in that time he had fought alongside dozens of species from across the known galaxy. He had seen the Crethani charge into battle with their 4 arms, swinging plasma blades, and he had watched the Morvasi calculate firing solutions with mathematical precision that bordered on art. But none of them confused him quite like the humans did 3 cycles ago. The Coalition had welcomed humanity into their ranks, and Velith had been assigned to work with them as part of an integration initiative. He considered himself an expert on their peculiarities by now. They laughed when they were nervous, and they made jokes about death as if it were an old friend rather than an enemy. They formed attachments to one another that defied tactical logic, and they would risk mission objectives to save a single wounded comrade. Velith found these behaviors inefficient, but he had learned to work around them. The humans were capable warriors despite their emotional handicaps, and that was what mattered in the end. A chime sounded through the observation deck, and Velith turned away from the viewport. The briefing was about to begin. He made his way through the corridors of the endless vigil with his 6 limbs carrying him in the smooth gliding motion characteristic of his species. The Thalvari other crew members stepped aside as he passed, and he noted their various expressions of respect or fear or simple acknowledgement. The Thalvari were known throughout the Coalition for many things, but chief among them was their complete and total absence of what other species called fear. Was not a matter of bravery or courage or any such concept. The Thalvari simply did not possess the neurological pathways necessary to experience terror. They processed dangerous data, and they responded to threats with calculated precision. Fear was as foreign to them as breathing underwater or seeing in colors beyond the visible spectrum. It was simply not part of their biological makeup. Velith entered the briefing room and found it already crowded with officers from a dozen species. Admiral Chun Wei stood at the front of the room with her arms clasped behind her back and her expression grave. She was human, and Velith had worked with her long enough to recognize the signs of tension in her posture. Beside her stood a holographic display, showing the moon below and the mining complex that had been carved into its crust 6 hours ago. Admiral Chun began, and her voice carried the weight of bad news. We lost contact with mining colony Surthax 7 Alpha. The display shifted to show the layout of the underground facility. The colony housed 237 personnel, including miners, engineers, and a security garrison of 40 soldiers. What happened to them? Asked a Crethani captain from across the room. Admiral Chen's jaw tightened in a way that Velith had learned to associate with human distress. We do not know, she said. The initial distress call reported something emerging from the deep tunnels, and then all communication ceased. She paused and looked around the room. Not one signal after the first 10 minutes. And when we sent a reconnaissance drone, it found the facility intact and operational, but completely empty. A murmur ran through the assembled officers, and Velith processed this information with interest. 100 people vanishing in less than 6 hours was an unusual tactical scenario. He began running probability calculations on potential causes. I'm assembling a strike team to investigate. Admiral Chung continued. Commander Velith, you will lead the ground operation, and Sergeant Major Vance will serve as your second in command. Velith inclined his head in acknowledgement, and across the room he saw a human woman do the same. Sergeant Major Elena Vance was one of the few humans Velith found tolerable to work with. She did not engage in excessive emotional displays, and she kept her jokes to a minimum. More importantly, she was an exceptionally competent soldier who had survived campaigns that had killed officers with twice her experience. After the briefing, Velith found her in the armory checking her weapons with methodical precision. Sergeant Major, he greeted her. I trust you are prepared for the mission. Elena looked up, and there was something in her eyes that Velith could not quite classify, as prepared as anyone can be for something like this. She said, "You seem troubled." Elena was quiet. For a moment, as she slid a power cell into her rifle. 200 soldiers in 6 hours, Commander, and not one distress call after the first 10 minutes. Yes. Velith agreed. It is an unusual scenario, and I have been calculating potential explanations. Have you now? Elena's voice carried a tone that Velith recognized as what humans called sarcasm. And what do your calculations tell you? That we are dealing with an unknown threat of considerable capability. Velith replied, "But unknown does not mean unknowable, and once we have gathered sufficient data, we will be able to formulate an effective response." Elena stared at him for a long moment, and then she laughed. It was not a happy sound. "You really do not feel it, do you?" she said. "You Thelvari really cannot understand what the rest of us are experiencing right now. I understand that many species experience a chemical response to perceived danger." Velith said, "I simply do not share that response, and I fail. To see how it would improve our tactical effectiveness. Maybe it would not," Elena admitted, "but it might help you understand why the rest of us are checking our weapons 3 times instead of once." She stood and slung her rifle over her shoulder. "Come on, Commander, and let us go see what made 200 people disappear." Without a trace, the dropship descended through the toxic atmosphere of Surthax 7, and Velith sat among his team, watching them prepare. The strike force consisted of 12 soldiers, including 6 Thelvari officers and 6 humans. The humans were engaging in what they called gallows humor and making jokes about death and disaster that Velith found illogical. He noted this behavior in his personal log as another example of human irrationality. Beside him, Elena sat in silence with her eyes fixed on the viewport where the mining complex was slowly coming into view. "Whatever is down there," she said quietly, and Velith turned to listen. "It killed 200 soldiers in 6 hours, and not one of them managed to send a warning after those first 10 minutes. She checked her weapon one more time, and Velith noticed that her hands were not quite steady. "That means it was fast, Commander, and it means they never saw it coming, or they saw it and could not believe what they were seeing." Velith considered this. "We will gather data, and we will adapt," he said. "That is the Thelvari way." Elena looked at him, and for the first time, he noticed something in her eyes that he could not classify with his existing frameworks. It was not anger, or sadness, or determination. It was something older and deeper, and more primal than any of those things. "I hope your way works, Commander," she said as the dropship touched down on the landing pad. "Because my people have a different way, and right now every instinct I have is screaming at me to get back on this ship and never look back." The loading ramp descended, and the mining complex stretched out before them, silent and waiting. Elena rose from her seat and checked her weapon one final time. "But we are going in anyway," she said, "because that is the human way," and she walked down the ramp into the silence with her hands steady. Now, despite whatever she was feeling inside, Velith followed her, and wondered for the first time if there was something about humans that his calculations had failed to account for. The mining complex was silent in a way that made Velith's audio sensors strain for any hint of sound. He had experienced quiet before, but this was different. This was the silence of a place that should have been filled with noise and life, but had been suddenly and completely emptied. The team moved through the main entrance corridor in tight formation with weapons raised and sensors. Active emergency lighting cast everything in a dim red glow that created shadows in every corner, and Velith noted that the humans had changed their behavior since leaving the dropship, moved differently now with tighter formations and slower breathing, and weapons that never lowered even for a moment. Elena walked beside him, and he could hear her heartbeat. Through his sensors, it was faster than normal human baseline, but her movements remain precise and controlled. The facility appears intact. Velith observed as they passed through a security checkpoint that had been left open. "That is what bothers me," Elena replied in a low voice. They entered the main operations center and found it exactly as the reconnaissance drone had shown. Workstations were active with screens displaying mining data and progress reports. Coffee cups sat on desks still warm to the touch. Equipment hummed with power as if waiting for operators who would never return. 237 people had simply vanished. "Fan out," Velith ordered. "Search for any evidence of what occurred here." The team spread through the operations center and began examining workstations and storage areas. One of the Thelvari scientists found the security logs and began analyzing them. "Commander," she called out after a few minutes. "The logs show normal activity until approximately 6 hours and 14 minutes ago, and then all personnel tracking simply stops." "Stops?" Elena repeated. "What do you mean stops?" "The tracking system shows 237 life signs one moment and 0 the next, and there is no gradual decrease, no individual disappearances, just complete and instantaneous cessation." Velith processed this information and found it did not match any scenario in his tactical databases. "That is impossible," said one of the human soldiers. "People do not just vanish all at once, and yet the data suggests precisely that." The Thelvari scientist replied. Elena moved to a nearby workstation and pulled up a different set of logs. "What about the initial distress call?" she asked. "Can we find the recording?" The scientist worked for a moment, and then a voice filled the operations center, crackling with static and terror. "This is Mining Colony Alpha requesting immediate assistance," the voice said, and Velith could hear panic in every word. "Something came out of the deep tunnels, and we cannot stop it, and it moves through the walls, and it makes no sound, and oh God, it is taking them one by one, and we cannot." The recording cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than before. "It moves through walls," Elena said quietly, "and it makes no sound. We should proceed to the lower levels," Velith said. "That is where this threat originated, and that is where we will find answers." "With respect, Commander," one of the human soldiers spoke up, and his voice shook slightly. "Maybe we should call for reinforcements first." Velith turned to look at him. "Reinforcements would take hours to arrive, and in that time, we have no way of knowing if this threat will spread beyond the facility, and we proceed now." The soldier did not argue, but Velith noted that his hands were trembling on his weapon. They made their way deeper into the complex, following the tunnels that led down into the moon's crust. Emergency lighting grew dimmer as they descended, and the shadows grew deeper and more numerous. Velith kept his sensors at maximum sensitivity, but detected nothing unusual. No life signs and no movement and no sound, except for their own footsteps echoing off the metal walls. Then they found the first evidence. Elena stopped suddenly and raised her fist in the signal for halt. "Commander," she said, and her voice was tight with something Velith could not identify. "Look at this." She pointed to the wall beside her, and Velith moved closer to examine it. Deep gouges had been carved into the metal surface as if something with enormous claws had raked across it. The marks were at least 3 centimeters deep, and they continued down the corridor as far as the light allowed them to see. "What could do this?" asked one of the Thelvari officers. "The metal in these walls is reinforced titanium alloy." Nobody answered. They continued forward, following the claw marks deeper into the tunnels until they heard something. It was a small sound and a human sound, and it came from somewhere ahead of them. A whimper. Elena moved first with her weapon raised and her body low. She approached a ventilation shaft set into the wall, and Velith saw that the grate had been torn away from the inside. "Someone is in there," Elena said, and she lowered her weapon slowly. "Hello, and can you hear me? And we are here to help." The whimpering stopped, and then a face appeared in the darkness of the shaft. It was a woman, and her eyes were wide and her skin was pale, and she looked at them as if she could not quite believe they were real. "You came," She whispered, "You actually came. We are from the Coalition warship Endless Vigil." Elena said gently, "What happened here, and where is everyone else?" The woman's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Gone," she said. "All. Gone, and they came out of nowhere, and they moved through the walls like the walls were. Not even there, and they took everyone one by one, and I hid and I listened to them scream, and then there was nothing." Elena helped her out of the ventilation. Shaft and Velith examined her for injuries. She was physically unharmed, but her eyes had a distant quality that suggested severe psychological trauma. "Can you tell us what they looked like?" Velith asked. The woman shook her head violently. "I did not look," she said. "I could not look, and I just closed my eyes and covered my ears and prayed they would not find me." She suddenly grabbed Elena's arm with desperate strength. "You have to leave," she said. "You have to take me and leave right now because they are still here and they are waiting and they know you are here. We cannot leave." Velith said, "We have to understand what we are dealing with." The woman stared at him, and then she laughed, and it was a broken sound with no humor in it. "Understand," she repeated. "You want to understand, and let me tell you what I understand, Commander." She pointed down the corridor toward the deeper tunnels. "Down there is something that has been sleeping for longer than your species has existed, and now it is awake, and it is hungry, and you cannot fight it, and you cannot reason with it, and you can only run." Elena's hand was trembling, and Velith noticed this because he had never seen her hands shake before. "Commander," she said, and her voice was steady despite the tremor. "My people have a word for what we are feeling right now, and it is called dread." Velith looked at her with interest. "Is that different from fear?" Elena did not get a chance to answer. The lights went out in the absolute darkness. Velith heard sounds that his sensors could not identify and movement that his tactical systems could not track. Then he heard something he had never heard before. A human scream of pure terror cut short in an instant of wet silence. When the emergency lighting flickered back to life, 3 members of his team were gone. Simply gone, as if they had never existed. And Elena Vance was loading her weapon with hands that shook like leaves in a storm, while her eyes had turned to something hard and cold like steel in winter. "They are here," she said, and her voice did not waver even as her body trembled. "And now we fight." They ran through the tunnels with the darkness hunting them from every direction. Velith had lost count of how many times the lights had failed, and how many times they had flickered back to reveal another empty space where a team member had been standing. 9 of them remained now, and the creatures were all around them, moving through walls and ceilings as if solid matter meant nothing to them. He caught glimpses of them in the strobing emergency lights, and each glimpse made his processing center struggle to make sense of what he was seeing. They were wrong in ways that his biological databases could not explain. Their forms seemed to exist partially out of phase with reality, shifting and flickering like images on a damaged screen. They had too many limbs or not enough, and their bodies did not obey the laws of physics that Velith had spent his entire life trusting. "Keep moving," Elena shouted from somewhere ahead of him, and her voice was raw with something that sounded almost like pain. They reached a sealed bulkhead, and one of the Thalvari scientists worked frantically at the controls while the rest of the team formed a defensive perimeter. The creatures circled them in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the emergency lights. Valth could not see them, but he could feel their presence like a pressure against his mind. "Got it," the scientist called out, and the bulkhead groaned open just enough for them to squeeze through one at a time. They tumbled into the chamber beyond, and the bulkhead sealed behind them with a sound like a thunderclap. For a moment, there was silence. Then everyone started talking at once, and Velith realized that he could not process all the data his senses were feeding him. His tactical systems were overwhelmed with inputs that did not match any known parameters. His decision matrices kept returning the same result over and over: insufficient information, insufficient information, insufficient information. and his body was doing something strange. His cardiac rhythm had elevated beyond normal parameters, and his sensory inputs had become hypersensitive to every shadow and every sound. There was a persistent signal running through his neural pathways that he could not identify. It felt like a warning, but it was more than that. It was an imperative, an overwhelming urge to flee, to run, to escape, to get as far away from this place as physically possible. Velth did not understand what was happening to him. He was Thelvery. Did not feel fear. He processed danger as data and responded with calculated precision. But his calculations were not working, and his precision had abandoned him, and all that remained was this incomprehensible signal screaming through his mind, telling him that he was in the presence of something that could destroy him utterly. He must be malfunctioning. There was no other explanation. Elena noticed. She crossed the chamber to where he stood with her weapon still in her hands and her breath coming fast and hard. "You are feeling it now," she said, and it was not a question. "That thing my people have carried since we first looked into the dark and knew something was looking back." "I do not know what you mean," Veleth said, but his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Elena studied him for a long moment. "Commander, your hands are shaking." Veleth looked down and saw that she was right. His manipulator appendages were trembling with a fine, rapid motion that he could not control. "I am malfunctioning," he said. "My systems are not responding correctly to the tactical situation." Elena shook her head. "You are not malfunctioning, Commander, and you are experiencing fear for the first time in your life. That is impossible, and the Thelvery do not feel fear. Maybe you did not before," Elena said. "But something about this place and these creatures has changed that." She sat down heavily on a storage crate, and for the first time, Veleth saw exhaustion written across her features. "Let me tell you something about fear, Commander," she said. "It is not a malfunction, and it is not a weakness, and it is a message. A message. Yes, and the message is simple, and it says that you are facing something that might actually destroy you, and your body and your mind are trying to prepare you for that possibility." Veleth processed this. "And how does one prepare for destruction?" Elena smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You do not, and that is the point. And fear is not about preparation, and it is about awareness." She checked her ammunition, and Veleth noticed that her hands were shaking just as badly as his. "Here is the thing about humans, Commander, and I want you to understand this because it might be the most important thing I ever tell you." She looked up at him with eyes that held terror and determination in equal measure. "We have been getting this message our entire evolutionary history, and every human who has ever lived has felt this same fear, and the fear of the dark, and the fear of the predator, and the fear of death itself, and we are used to it." "Used to it," Veleth repeated. "How can one become accustomed to such a thing?" Before Elena could answer, the walls of the chamber began to shake. The creatures had found them. They phased through the metal like ghosts rising from graves, and suddenly the chamber was full of flickering, nightmarish shapes reaching for them with limbs that bent in impossible directions. "Fire!" Elena screamed, and the world became chaos. Veleth raised his weapon and fired at the nearest creature, but his shot seemed to pass through it. Without effect around him, his team was fighting and dying, and the creatures took them one by one with terrible efficiency. Thelvari, officer to his left, was simply gone between one heartbeat and the next day. Human soldier on his right screamed once and then fell silent, and through it all, Veleth felt that signal in his mind growing louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. He was going to die here. He was going to die, and there was nothing he could do to stop it then. He saw Alana. She was standing in the center of the chamber, with creatures closing in from every direction, and tears were streaming down her face. She was clearly terrified, and her whole body was shaking with it, and her breath came in ragged gasps that sounded almost like sobs, and she was fighting with absolute precision. Her shots found their marks even when her hands trembled, and her movements were fluid, and controlled even as she wept with fear. She saved a Thelvari scientist by pulling him out of a creature's grasp. While screaming in what sounded like anguish, she covered the retreat of 2 human soldiers. While tears blurred her vision, she was broken with terror and she was functioning perfectly, and Velith could not understand how both of those things could be true at the same time. The attack ended as suddenly as it had begun. The creatures withdrew into the walls and vanished, leaving behind only the survivors and the silence. Of them, remained Viololf found Elena, leaning against a wall with her weapon still raised and her eyes scanning the shadows for movement. "How did you do that?" he asked, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Do what?" "You were terrified, and I could see it, and I could hear it, and you were completely overwhelmed with fear, and yet you fought with perfect precision." Elena lowered her weapon slowly and looked at him with exhausted eyes. "Commander, you are asking the wrong question." "What do you mean?" "You think fear and function are opposites, and you think that being afraid means being unable to act. And that is not how it works for humans." She wiped blood from her face, and Velith noted that it was not her own. "Fear is just the first step, Commander, and it is the warning signal that tells you something terrible is happening." She pushed herself off the wall and checked her remaining ammunition. "What matters is what comes after, and what comes after fear." Elena looked at him, and despite everything they had just survived, there was something almost like hope in her eyes. "That is what you are about to learn, Commander, and I suggest you pay attention, because it might be the only thing that keeps us alive." The 5 survivors pushed deeper into the mining complex, because going back meant certain death. Velith led them with Elena at his side, and behind them came 2 Thelvari scientists and a single human soldier named Marcus, whose hands had not stopped shaking since the last attack. They found the source 3 levels below where they had been ambushed. It was an ancient structure buried beneath the moon's crust, and it predated any civilization in the Coalition's historical records. The architecture was wrong in the same way the creatures were wrong, with angles that did not quite connect and surfaces that seemed to shift when viewed from different positions. And it was humming with power. "What is this place?" Marcus whispered, and his voice echoed strangely in the vast chamber. 1 of the Thelvari scientists approached a console that had been partially excavated by the mining operation. "This is what they uncovered," she said. "The mining crews broke through into this structure, and whatever was inside has been awakened." "The creatures," Elena said. "Yes, and they appear to be guardians or perhaps prisoners that were released when the seal was broken." Velith examined the structure more closely and noticed symbols carved into its surface. They were not in any language his databases recognized, but they seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. "There is more," the scientist continued, and her voice carried a weight of dread that Velith had never heard from one of his own species before. "The structure is broadcasting a signal, and it is aimed at a point in deep space, approximately 400 light years from our position." Elena turned sharply. "Broadcasting what kind of signal?" "I cannot be certain, but based on the power levels and the pattern of transmission, it appears to be a beacon of some kind." "A beacon for what?" The scientist was quiet. For a moment, something larger. Velith felt that signal in his mind spike with renewed intensity. The creatures they had faced were merely guardians. Something else was coming, something worse. "Can we stop the signal?" he asked. "Possibly, and the structure appears to have a central power core that, if disrupted, might cease the transmission." "Where is it?" The scientist pointed toward the heart of the structure where the humming was loudest. "Approximately 200 meters in that direction. But Commander, the creatures are concentrated in that area, and there are dozens of them, maybe hundreds." Velith processed this information and ran probability calculations on their chances of reaching the core and surviving. The numbers came back 0. No survival scenario existed. They did not have enough ammunition or personnel to fight through that many creatures. The logical calculation was clear. They should retreat to the surface and call for evacuation and let the coalition deal with this threat from orbit with heavy weapons. But even as he processed this conclusion, Velith knew it would not work. The creatures could phase through solid matter. Orbital bombardment would destroy the structure, but the creatures would simply disperse into the surrounding rock. They would spread across the moon and eventually find a way off this world. And then they would be everyone's problem. Someone had to reach that power core. Someone had to shut down the beacon before whatever was being summoned arrived, and whoever went would not be coming back. Velith looked at his remaining team and felt fear coursing through him with an intensity that made rational thought nearly impossible. Every shadow contained threat. Every silence promised violence. Every heartbeat brought them closer to an end that his mind could not stop imagining in terrible detail. He understood now what Elena had meant about the message. His body was telling him that he was going to die, and there was nothing he could do to change that. He found the sensation almost unbearable. How do you survive feeling this way? He asked Elena quietly. How do humans function with this constant awareness of mortality? Elena laughed, and it was the first time she had laughed since they entered the facility. Commander, we do not survive it, and not unchanged anyway, and fear breaks you every single time. She looked at the ancient structure, humming with impossible energy. But humans figured out something else a long time ago, and we learned to break back. I do not understand. Resolve, Elena said, and she spoke the word like it was something sacred. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. She turned to face him fully. You ask me what comes after fear, and the answer is a choice, and you can let the fear control you and freeze you and stop you in your tracks, or you can acknowledge the fear and accept it and then move forward anyway. That sounds irrational. It is completely irrational, and that is the point. She smiled, and for a moment she looked almost peaceful despite everything. My people have a word for this, Commander, and we call it courage. And here is the thing you need to understand about courage. She placed a hand on his chest right where his primary cardiac organ was racing with terror. Courage does not exist without fear, and you cannot be brave if you are not afraid, and the fear is not the enemy of courage. Commander, her eyes met his. Fear is the fire in which courage is forged. The creatures began to mass in the shadows. At the edges of the chamber, Velith could see them now, dozens of them flickering in and out of phase with reality. They were waiting. They knew there was nowhere left to run. Velith prepared to meet his end with what remained of Thelvery stoicism. He would process his final moments as data, and he would observe his own destruction with detached precision. It was the way of his people. Then Elena Vance stood up. No, she said, just that one word, and she began walking toward the creatures. Velith stared at her in incomprehension. Sergeant Major, what are you doing? What I have to do, she said without turning around. The calculations show no survival scenario, and you will, Guy. I know. Then why? She stopped and looked back at him, and there were tears in her eyes again, but also something else. Something that burned brighter than the fear. Because someone has to shut down that beacon, Commander, and because those things took 200 people who were just trying to do their jobs, and because if I do not try, then everything we went through means nothing. Marcus stood up. His hands were still shaking, and his face was pale with terror, but he walked forward to stand beside Elena. I am coming with you, he said. Marcus, you do not have to. Yes, I do. The two Thalvari scientists looked at each other, and then they too rose and joined the Humansvold. Watched in incomprehension as his team formed up around Elena. They were all terrified. He could see it in their vital signs and their trembling hands and their rapid breathing. They knew they were going to die. They were walking forward anyway, into certain death. The Velthvold realized he was witnessing something his species had no category for, something that his databases could only classify as human resolve, and he realized something else. He could not let them go alone. He felt the fear screaming through his mind, telling him to run, to hide, to save himself. But there was something else now, something newer and stranger and more powerful than the fear. It was a choice. Elena had been right. He acknowledged the fear, he accepted it, and then he moved forward anyway. Sergeant Major. He called out, and Elena turned to look at him. I believe I'm beginning to understand. He walked to join them with his weapon raised and his heart's pounding with terror. Let us shut down this beacon together. Elena smiled at him, and it was the most genuine smile he had ever seen from a human. Welcome to being brave, Commander. They charged together into the swarm of creatures with screams of terror, mixing with war cries, and Velith discovered that courage and fear could exist in the same moment, in the same heart, in the same desperate charge toward almost certain death. Commander Velith Kyranos opened his eyes to the soft hum of medical equipment and the sterile white ceiling of the endless Vigil Infirmary. For a long moment, he did not remember where he was or how he had gotten there. Then the memories came flooding back, the creatures and the darkness and the fear and the charge into what should have been certain death. He tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. A medical technician noticed his movement and hurried over. Commander, please remain still. And you have sustained significant injuries, and you need rest. The mission, Velith said, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. What happened to the mission? The mission was successful, the technician said. The beacon was shut down, and the structure was collapsed, and the creatures have been contained. My team. The technician hesitated. 3 survivors, Commander, including yourself. 3 out of 12 of Velith closed his eyes and processed this information. Who else survived? The 2 Thelvery scientists did not make it, and Private Marcus Chun did not make it, and Sergeant Major Vance survived, but she is in critical condition in the next ward. Elena was a limb of Velith felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was tight. I need to see her. Commander, your injuries. I need to see her now. The technician looked at him for a long moment and then sighed. I will bring a mobility assist unit. They transported Velith to the adjacent ward, and there he found Elena Vance lying in a medical bed surrounded by regeneration equipment. 3 of her limbs were encased in healing chambers, and her face was covered with sensor patches monitoring her neural activity. She looked broken in ways that went beyond physical damage, but when she saw him, her eyes lit up with recognition. Commander, she said, and her voice was weak but warm. You made it. As did you. Barely. Velith positioned his mobility unit beside her bed and looked at her with something he was still learning to identify as gratitude. You stayed, Elena said, at the end. When we charged and you could have run, but you stayed. Velith thought about this for a moment. When the humans had begun their charge, something in him had refused to let them go alone. He had joined them not because of tactical calculations or probability assessments, but because of something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with logic. I experienced fear, he said. True fear, and I did not know such a thing was possible for my kind. Elena smiled weakly. And how was it? Velith considered the question carefully. Terrible and overwhelming and completely irrational. That sounds about right. But also illuminating. He leaned forward slightly. I believe I understand now why humans are such formidable warriors, and it is not despite your fear, and it is because of it. Elena raised an eyebrow. Go on. You have practiced facing the end of all things. Since the dawn of your species, and every generation of humans has stared into the darkness, knowing that something might be staring back, and you have learned to function in the presence of that knowledge. He paused, gathering his thoughts. You have learned to stand in the shadow of your own extinction, and simply refuse to stop. Elena laughed softly. That is one way to put it. Velith reached out and placed his manipulator appendage on her hand. It was a human gesture that he had observed, but never performed, and he found that it felt right in this moment. I watched you walk toward death, screaming with terror, he said. Your hands were shaking and tears were streaming down your face, and every part of your body was telling you to run. His voice dropped lower, and you did not slow down, and you did not hesitate, and you kept fighting even when you could barely see through your fear. Elena was quiet for a moment. That is what humans do, Commander, and we feel the fear, and then we keep going anyway. I have no framework for such a thing. Veleth admitted, my people have never developed one, and we have never needed to, because we do not feel fear. He looked at the regeneration chambers encasing her limbs. But I felt it down there in those tunnels, and I understand now why courage is so highly valued among species that experience terror. Why is that? Because it is the hardest thing in the universe to achieve, and it requires you to override every survival instinct your evolution has given you, and it requires you to choose to move forward when everything in your being is screaming at you to flee. He met her eyes. I am honored, Sergeant Major, and deeply honored to have fought beside that kind of resolve. Elena squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. No, Commander, you did not do so badly yourself. I was terrified. Yes, you were. I could barely think straight. Probably true. My calculations were completely useless. Elena smiled. And yet here you are, and you charged with us, and you fought with us, and you did not let us go alone, even when every logical part of your brain was telling you to run. She paused. That is courage, Commander, and welcome to the club. Vela stayed with her until the medical staff insisted he return to his own bed over. The following days he recovered from his injuries and consulted with Thelvery physicians about his unprecedented experience. They were baffled that Thelvery were not supposed to be capable of fear, and their neurology simply did not include the necessary pathways. The best hypothesis they could offer was that prolonged exposure to human neurochemistry combined with extreme stress had temporarily activated dormant systems in his brain. The effect was already fading. They told him soon he would return to normal. Thelvery, emotional Baseline Veleth, found that he did not want it to fade. He returned to duty 3 weeks later. Elena was still recovering, and the physician said it would be months before she was fully healed, but she was making progress on. His first day back, Veleth went to see her one more time. I have been thinking about what you taught me. He told her about fear and courage and what comes after. And what have you concluded? That I do not think I will fear anything else ever again. Elena tilted her head. That seems unlikely, Commander, and fear is part of life for most species. Perhaps. But I have seen what true courage looks like now, and I have witnessed beings who were utterly terrified choose to face their death rather than abandon their mission or their comrades. He straightened slightly. Compared to that, what else is there to fear, and what could possibly be more terrifying than what we faced in those tunnels? And yet, you faced it anyway. He reached into his uniform and pulled out a small piece of fabric. It was a patch from Elena's unit that he had recovered from the mining complex. I am keeping this, he said, as a reminder of what humans are capable of, and of what fear really means, and of what comes after. He turned to leave but stopped at the doorway. When young officers ask me about humans, I am going to tell them something. What? Is that humans feel fear more deeply than any species in the coalition, and that they are not brave because they are fearless, but because they are terrified and fight anyway. He looked back at her. When you see a human's hands shake before battle, do not mistake it for weakness, because that is the sign of a being who knows exactly how much they have to lose and has decided to risk it all. Regardless, Elena smiled at him with warmth that transcended species and culture and everything that should have separated them. That is a good thing to tell them, Commander. Veleth inclined his head in a Thelvery gesture of deepest respect. I experienced my first true fear fighting beside human resolve, Sergeant Major, and I learned that fear is not the enemy of courage. He held up the patch. Fear is the fire in which courage is forged. Then he walked out of the medical bay and back into his duties, and for the rest of his career, he carried that patch with him. Everywhere he went, a reminder of the darkness, a reminder of the fear, and most importantly, a reminder of the humans who walked into that darkness, shaking with terror and refused to stop. Because that was the human way, and Velith had learned that it was the most remarkable thing in the entire galaxy.